Hey guys, so today I'm going to be talking about the victims of the Tinder Swindler, and I want to talk about it from a different perspective in terms of why the victims stayed and why they gave him money, what the biochemical processes were that happened that make it likely that victims stay with the abusers for a lot longer than you think, or do things that you think, oh my god, like how did they do that? How did they give him so much money? That's crazy. I would never do that if that was me, blah, 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 blah. But it's very easy to say that in hindsight, especially if you don't understand what actually happens in the brain and what happens emotionally and psychologically when you're in an abusive relationship. So hopefully this video will shed a bit of light as to why I think that it's not helpful and not responsible to victim blame these men and women. I'm sure there are male victims of him as well, because of the complexities of that type of relationship. Everything I talk about today is going to be based on research and specifically a book by Shahida Arabi. And the title of the book is called Your Brain on Love, Sex and the Narcissist: The Biochemical Bonds That Create an Addiction to Our Abusers. I highly recommend checking this book out. I think it's only about 30 or so pages. It's quite small and it's pretty cheap. I think you can buy it on Amazon. So 100% check it out. It's really, really useful. All of the information I talk about today is going to be harnessed from that book. So let me start off by saying that if you're in an abusive relationship and you leave or you withdraw from the abusive person, it has the same biochemical effects in the brain, really similar to drug addiction, to class A drugs. So that's how powerful it is in the person. It's not just as simple as like, oh, you need to just walk away. And another reason as to why it takes on average 7 times to leave a relationship that's abusive, because people keep going back, because just like drug addiction, it's really difficult. The road is quite curvy until eventually, you get away from the drug and you recover. Same thing with this. You tend to keep going back to the abuser and eventually, hopefully, you get away. I also think it's important to say that the author decided to compile this research because she realized as a therapist that people that were coming into her clinic who were victims of abuse, they weren't stupid people. They were intelligent. They were articulate. They were insightful. They weren't people that you would think or that you would classify into just kind of blasé saying, oh no, they're just obviously really stupid. Those women, how could they be that stupid? That wasn't the case at all. So I just want to kind of preface that by saying that again is almost like a stereotype, that if someone's in an abusive relationship and they keep going back or they're sending the person money, they're automatically being labeled as stupid. But you don't have to be stupid to be in an abusive relationship and be manipulated to the point where you're doing things like that. So there's various different biochemical bonds that keep people locked into these relationships. And I'm going to talk about each one. The first one is oxytocin. But it's naturally released in the brain when pleasurable things happen. So, if you're getting a hug or if you're kissing someone during sex, it can be with romantic people, it can be family and friends. Like when a mother and a baby breastfeed, helps to promote the bond and the trust. So the same things happen in an abusive relationship, except the oxytocin that's released is at a super high level, because initially in these abusive relationships, there's loads of love bombing, which you can see with the Tinder Swindler. So, he's really quickly, really fast saying he wants to marry these people, he wants to have kids with them, there's never been anyone like them in his life, and blah, 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 and all of this crazy kind of fantastical stuff. But when you're in that situation, and you think you've met the man or woman of your dreams, and they're giving you all of this love, all of this affection, your brain is going to be releasing crazy amounts of oxytocin, which promotes this really intense bond with the person. So you trust them probably more than you trust a lot of other people in your life, if not the most. So it's incredibly powerful. Something else happens in an abusive relationship. So because the oxytocin is released, and it's released during times that you deem pleasurable, and it might just be because the abuser is positively interacting with you. It might be during the love bombing stage at the start. It could be during the devaluing phase where they're kind of sick of you at this point, but every now and again they give you little bits of breadcrumbs here and there. And when that happens, you're intermittently reinforced, or your behavior has been intermittently reinforced. And basically what that means is it makes it even harder to leave, because it's akin to, the best example is probably gambler at a slot machine, that sometimes they win, sometimes they lose, and that's why they keep gambling. They don't win every single time, they don't lose every single time, but they know that sometimes they're going to win, so they're going to keep putting in the money. Same thing in an abusive relationship, that you're going to keep going, because you know sometimes you get something back. A lot of the time you don't, but sometimes you do. So you keep trying to chase that of, you know, that time that they were really nice to you, and like, oh, what can you do to get that back again? And then it kind of just becomes a cycle. But within that, every time that they are giving you like affection or love or praise or whatever it may be, your brain is releasing
OXYTOCIN.
And so it's gone through like ups and downs of
OXYTOCIN
and being released, which makes the bond even harder to break because it's being intermittently reinforced. Hope that makes sense. So in general life, intermittent reinforcement is really powerful. It's basically the most powerful schedule of reinforcement, it's called. And it's the most powerful because, like I was saying, people don't know when it's going to happen. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. So your life in general is full of these schedules of intermittent reinforcement. For example, every time you go on Facebook, sometimes you go on there, you might get no notifications. Another time you click on, you might have 10 notifications. The next time you might have 2. The next time you might have none. The next time you might have none. But you keep going and going and going because you think, oh, okay, eventually, like there's going to be, I'm going to log in and I'm going to have some comments. Same kind of thing with looking at your phone. You know, you take it out, you look at it. Nothing on the screen, put it back in your pocket. A few minutes later, take it out, look at it. Same thing, nothing on the screen. Eventually, when you take it out, you're going to have notifications on the screen, you know, from WhatsApp or whatever. So your behavior of looking at the phone is getting intermittently reinforced. It's literally everywhere. And in an abusive relationship, it's no different, except it's basically like intermittent reinforcement, but on steroids, because of what's happening in your brain biochemically at the same time. So the women in the Tinder Swindler, the victims, 100% would have been getting intermittently reinforced. So that's what would keep them hooked on talking to him. And it may have been quite subtle in terms of how he initially started to intermittently reinforce their behaviors. So he may have, you know, not been as quick to respond to their texts as he usually would, or maybe not calling them as much as he normally would. And then you have to remember at the same time that these victims in the Tinder Swindler, they're going through the love bombing phase. He's incapable of that form of attachment due to his narcissism or psychopathy. He can't have that type of attachment. So that's why it's so easy for him to essentially be with one woman and then literally go off the next day or within an hour and have the exact same conversations with another woman, you know, telling another woman that they're going to have kids, they're going to have a family, blah, blah, blah. Because to him, he never formed the attachment in the first place. But the victim doesn't know that. To them, he's their whole world. But to him, they mean essentially nothing. They're just there to give him a source of kind of supply, fuel. And before I move on to the next biochemical factor, another interesting point to remember is that it's actually more difficult for women to break free because of their levels of estrogen in terms of
OXYTOCIN.
And what I mean by that is that estrogen actually promotes bonding through
OXYTOCIN,
whereas testosterone, which would be obviously higher in a male body, discourages the bond. And that's probably evolutionary. So, you know, the male can kind of carry on easier and reproduce, whereas the woman tends to obviously want to stay or nest and have the baby and all the rest of it. And also, interestingly enough, there's actually been quite a few studies done where women tend to be more attracted to men that have more psychopathic traits or higher on that spectrum, which I guess is a whole other video, but yeah, that's quite interesting to know as well. The second biochemical factor at play in these abusive relationships, which makes victims stay, is dopamine. So dopamine plays a pretty important role in an abusive relationship because dopamine is often released when victims think about past memories, which is quite intense and again can create that bonding experience because you want more of it. You need to go, in this case, back to the person. You need to keep talking to them because you want more of that dopamine hit. And interestingly, the brain releases dopamine in the same way that it does through drug use, the same way that it does when you ruminate or think back on pleasurable memories. So for these women, that means that even say in the stages where he is asking for loads of money, the women are more than likely thinking back to the very start of the relationship, where there's the love bombing phase, and thinking of all the nice things that he said, all the nice things that he did, and they're getting these kind of hits of dopamine. So it's almost like your brain's way of keeping you trapped to keep repeating the same cycle over and over again. So if the abuser is asking to borrow money, even if you think at that point, say if you're in the devaluing phase and you think something might be up, that's, should I do this or not? At the same time, you're going to be ruminating and think about the past. You're going to be thinking about those memories of when they were really nice to you. And that's going to make your brain give you dopamine hits, which again increases the bond, like the feelings of trust. And you want to feel like you want that again. So you need to keep interacting with the abuser, which kind of almost tricks you into this false sense of trust and belief that like, oh no, it's this person, they'd never mess me about, they'd never do that to me, never steal from me, they'd never lie to me. And again, with dopamine, it also works really well with intermittent reinforcement. It's actually more steadily released by the brain when it's released in an unpredictable fashion, i.e. when the abuser is, nice to you sometimes, but not all the time. So then when you do get the hits of dopamine when they are being nice to you, or when you're thinking back on old memories, it's actually really intense. It's a really intense hit of dopamine. And interestingly, a study by Fisher in 2016 stated that when we have obstacles in the face of love, this type of unpredictable schedule with dopamine, and when it's released in your brain through intermittent reinforcement, actually heightens the romantic feelings that you have for the abuser / your partner. So again, another reason why you wouldn't want to leave and why you would trust when they're telling you, oh, I'll pay you back this money, please, like, we're going to get married, do you not trust me, blah, 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 all of that sort of stuff. You're going to fall for that because of what's happening in your brain. Sadly, the cycle of abuse of intermittent reinforcement is actually strengthening all of these biochemical reactions in the brain, making it a rewarding experience in your brain versus deterring you from this person. So all of these things combined make it more likely that you're going to believe the person if they say, please lend me this money, I've been attacked, whatever the hell he's made up, I'll give it back to you as soon as possible. You believe them because of what's happening in your brain biochemically. And it's important to mention that while these biochemical things are happening that we've discussed so far, the
OXYTOCIN
and dopamine, there's also cognitive dissonance happening. Two different set of beliefs about the person in your mind at one time. So in terms of the Tinder Swindler victims, it could be that, oh my God, he's like this super nice guy and he's the love of my life and we're going to have babies together, we're going to get married. And then you might also have the belief that, oh, this is a bit strange, like he's asking me for money, is that a bit weird? Like, should I give him the money? So the dopamine release exacerbates this. So you can't really look at that rationally as you would if those biochemical reactions weren't happening. So you can't think, actually, taking all that love and stuff, or what I think is love, aside, no, this isn't right that he's asking me for this money. This is kind of weird. Why is he asking me for that much money? The relationship's so fast paced. He doesn't even know me really, and he's telling me that he loves me. But you can't do that if you're subject to cognitive dissonance and these biochemical processes are happening at the same time. The biochemical mashup that's happening in their brains is so extreme at this point that I guarantee people in the same position probably would have done the same thing. And it's really difficult to think that or believe that, but we're all subject to that as people that are neurotypical. That's how our brains work. Biochemical number 3 is serotonin. So when we fall in love, our serotonin levels actually drop to the same level that is usually found in a person with obsessive compulsive disorder. So that's why when you fall in love, you tend to kind of become obsessed with the person. You think about them all the time, you ruminate about them all the time. when you're with them, that change in serotonin regulates your mood. And even when you're not with them, because you're still going to be thinking about them basically continuously, because that's like the natural stage of falling in love. So this is another reason why in those early stages, and even further down the line with some of these women, because their mood was quite literally being regulated by the interaction with the Tinder swindler via the serotonin levels in their brain, they were obsessed with him. Therefore, you're going to be more likely, again, considering there's also
oxytocin,
dopamine and intermittent reinforcement going on, to trust, believe what he's telling you. You'd have no reason not to believe it, especially to the extravagant lengths that he went to purport this crazy lie. You're going to be much more likely to do things. You're going to be much more likely to give him money if he asks you for money. And that's bearing in mind that it's a person who has literally tried everything to convince you that he's a billionaire, from hiring security, from, hiring private jets, drivers, like going to hotels and ordering everything, wearing designer clothes from head to toe. It was more than an image. He created a lifestyle. Why would those women, on top of all the biochemical stuff, not believe that that wasn't true? So aside from all that, there's also the deceit that they thought this was true. And of course, if you think someone has that much money, they've asked you for some money, chances are you're going to be like, well, obviously he's going to pay me back. He's pretty loaded. Like, I wouldn't see why he wouldn't pay me back, because, we're also in love, and my brain is also doing these crazy things with chemicals that makes me more bonded to him, makes me trust him more. And another point which is interesting to note about serotonin is that when people have low levels of serotonin, they're more likely to engage in sexual behavior. And as we know, through the act of sex or any type of sexual gratification, your brain is going to release
oxytocin,
which again helps to strengthen the bond and trust the person. And of course, it also releases dopamine, which again does the same thing. So it's like a double whammy effect. The next biochemical, or biochemicals, I should say, that have a role to play are cortisol, adrenaline, and norepinephrine. Now, as most people will know, cortisol is a stress hormone. So you'll find it in the body at elevated rates if you're under a lot of stress. And the other two, adrenaline and norepinephrine, are found in response to a fight or flight situation. Now, cortisol, it's probably quite obvious why that would be getting released during an abusive relationship through most likely the devaluing phase and the discard phase. When cortisol is released, it's probably quite obvious why that would be released in the ups and downs of an abusive relationship, more than likely in the devaluing phase and the discard phase. That stress hormone cortisol also works in conjunction with
oxytocin.
So again, a lot of the biochemicals react together, which kind of compounds the whole thing even more. But what's quite bad about the cortisol is that often that's what causes PTSD in people that are in abusive relationships, because they're constantly in this super up and down, stressful, and then all of a sudden really falsely happy relationship. Their brain is all of a sudden releasing loads of dopamine, loads of
oxytocin,
and then all of a sudden, boom, it comes crashing down, and then you get cortisol, adrenaline, and all the rest of it. So it's just like a mad mix of biochemical reactions happening in your brain. Now, the other two, adrenaline and norepinephrine, tend to be released when there is a fight or flight response, which again happens quite a lot in an abusive relationship. But the cruel thing about that is that those kind of high levels of adrenaline also end up in a release of a high level of dopamine. So again, they're kind of connecting together, but making that biochemical bond even stronger. So if people go through a traumatic experience, either, as friends or a couple, whatever, they tend to be more bonded together So there was a study done on the couples that went to a theme park, and the couples that went on a roller coaster actually had a stronger bond than couples who didn't, because they experienced this fight or flight response. Their body reduced a big surge of adrenaline and cortisol and dopamine. So when your body is going through that as a victim, as these victims would have been with the Tinder swindler, the ups and downs, especially the example with the fake attack on the bodyguard, that would have been a good example of that kind of fight or flight response that they would have had, because he would often turn it around on them and say like, oh, you might not be safe now, you need to get out of here, I'm not safe, I need to go over here, I can't use this phone anymore, and all of this kind of shit. So it was just basically a shit show of biochemical reactions. And lastly, number 5 is all of the previous biochemical reactions merged together form something that you may have already heard of called trauma bonding. So this is a very, very intense state of attachment with another person, usually an abuser. And it's not as simple as saying like, oh, why didn't she just leave? Or why didn't, she just walk away? And the same thing as like, oh, why didn't she just say no when he asked her for the money? It's not that simple. And I mean, it kind of says what it does in the tin. It usually happens after a traumatic event, which is like what I was saying previously about his pretend stories, like the bodyguard getting attacked and people were after him and blah, 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 and that the girls were no longer safe. After that event, that would have caused a trauma bond with the victims and the Tinder swindler. So this would have made it even more difficult for them to detach from him. It actually would have made them more addicted to him biochemically. A trauma bond is also further compounded by the fact, not always though, but if you've had a childhood that you had a narcissistic parent or one of those cluster B personalities where there was that emotional manipulative abuse, you are then repeating the cycles that happened to you previously. So there's actually been a history of trauma bonding and that repetitive abusive cycle. So you potentially could be more locked in and more addicted to the cycle than someone, say, who hasn't experienced that in childhood. But again, that doesn't mean that people who have experienced it in childhood are, way more likely to get abused in that type of relationship. It can happen to anyone, even people that have healthy boundaries. I think anyone is susceptible. I think you're lucky if you have healthy boundaries in place and you can really take yourself out of that kind of intense, super loved up, love bombing stage at the start, and you have a strong support network around you to be your eyes and give you a bit of perspective and rationale and thinking like, does it seem a little bit strange? Talking about marriage within a couple of weeks and they're saying that they love you even though you've only met like twice. You need those people around you, I think, for clarity. And if you don't have that, it's going to be pretty hard to kind of see sense in that situation, even if you've had a healthy childhood. So this type of abuse, it's insidious. It's usually gradual. It doesn't just happen like overnight that he's like, oh, give me $50,000. And they're just going to be like, okay. There's a build up to it. People are groomed. Victims are groomed. They're manipulated. It's insidious. It's constant. It's all a complete lie. It's a massive facade. They're betrayed in every single way possible. They're betrayed romantically, financially, emotionally. I just really want to get across how severe those types of abusive relationships are. And I think it's really difficult because to try to explain them, if you haven't been in them, or you haven't maybe known someone who was in one, it can be really difficult to comprehend how a person gets to that point in their life where, say in this example, they're lending this man friggin' thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars in some cases. But because this is of such a big area of interest to me and a personal interest of mine, that I feel passionate about, I can 100% see why this would have happened and why it could have happened to so many other people. So it makes me really sad when I see online that people call these women, idiots or stupid. And it just, it kind of makes me mad as well, because I feel really sorry for them that society has chosen the side of the abuser versus the side of the victims. the focus should not be on the victims giving him money. It should be on him. Like, what the hell is he doing? Going around, you know, pretending that he's a billionaire, lying, cheating his way through life, extorting and stealing, manipulating large sums of money and tangible items off people in his past. And, you know, as it says later on in the series, that it wasn't just these women, there was some men involved as well. And I just find that, like, it's crazy. He almost gets away with it, and the focus is now shifted onto the victims being stupid. And it's like, what? You know, he created this massive lifestyle where he was this super wealthy man, and I don't know. It seems crazy to me that the focus isn't on him, and clearly the pathologies that he has that are incredibly damaging to every single person around him in his life that he'll ever come across and will ever come across. And the Netflix documentary really annoyed me because it didn't have any input from any type of psychologist or a therapist that specializes in narcissistic abuse or abuse from a person with antisocial personality disorder, that all follow that same type of cycle, the abuse cycle. Nothing to explain why the women did the things that they did. That really annoyed me, because then it did make the viewer come away with thinking like, oh my God, how could they have been that gullible? Like, how could they have been that stupid? And there's so much more to it than that. It's so much more complex than that. If it wasn't that complex, then he wouldn't be able to manipulate anyone. You know, there wouldn't be a massive string of victims all around the world where he's managed to extort large sums of money and items from. That wouldn't happen if he wasn't exceptionally good or abusive at doing what he does. Okay guys, I'll leave it at that for today. I might do a second part of this on why the women would stay or give him large sums of money based on the emotional and the psychological reasons why they stay. That's also in the book that I linked down below, which is also pretty interesting. But I hope that you enjoyed, and I hope that you find it informative and useful in some way, shape or form. And one of my future videos I want to do on a study that seems super interesting. It's about the 8 stages of coercive control. And genuinely, the information could save either your life if you're in an abusive relationship, or in the future, hopefully not, or one of your friends or family or someone you know, someone else's life. And I think everyone should read the study because it's so important. But yeah, I'm going to do a video on that one as well. But that is all for now, guys. Thanks for listening, and thanks everyone for subscribing and watching and all the rest of it. And I shall see you in the next one. Bye!